Constructed Environments, the first public program of the 2021-2022 academic year. It is, as you can well know, it's virtual, but we're very pleased that we have this as the kickoff. There it should be not a surprise to anyone that the number 51 billion gigatons of CO2 equivalent are released annually into the atmosphere. The thing that's interesting, and this is from the School of Constructed Environments, is that only 7% of this is related to the heating and cooling and operational energy of our constructed environments. A full 31% is from the energy used to make the things, the architecture, the interiors, the lighting, the products that make up our constructed environment. This is both a challenge, but it's also an extraordinary opportunity for the school because we have attention to be able to focus upon not only the impact of our designs when they're built, but the actual process of how it ends up getting made and the materials we choose. More importantly, those material choices, if done right, they're carbon sequestering materials, they can actually positively impact climate change by sequestering carbon. And it's that thought process that really is animating the transformations in our disciplines. But the consequences of our warming climate and extreme weather disproportionately impact those most vulnerable globally, which are the poor and the disenfranchised. And in this country, and in this city, given the longstanding structural racism of American society, those disproportionately impacted are Black and Brown communities. Our move to address carbon and materials must be examined through the frame of climate justice to create a regenerative future as we move beyond fossil fuels, and not just a technical pursuit, but a pursuit of social justice. In this light, I'm very pleased that our first talk in this year's public program is focused precisely on this issue. Before I hand it over to Brian McGrath, Professor of Urban Design at the School of Constructed Environments and the host for tonight's event, I want to thank the members of the public programs task force, particularly Andy Bernheimer, the chair, Derek Porter, Dan Mahalik, Mark Gardner, Alfred Zollinger, Alexandra Efemenko, and Coley Stein for organizing and coordinating and making this happen. So I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Brian McGrath to give the introduction to this first public program of SCE. And thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you so much, David. It's really great to start your deanship and the inspiring words that you started our faculty meeting, first faculty meeting with. And I think as a School of Architecture, Interior Design, Lighting Design, Product, Industrial Design, and Architecture, we're well equipped to really making a difference. And I'm particularly pleased to host this event because I have this great joy of being part of the Tishman Center for Environmental Design, and it's through my friendship with Mike Harrington, the assistant director of the Tishman Center, that I became aware of this work. And I think the work, like David has articulated, is not just really timely and important for all of us at SE and professions at large, but also I think this work represents a model for our students when they graduate, because in order to construct the kinds of practices that we need to do as designers in the future, we need to do what these four young professionals have done, which is to form interdisciplinary alliances and to work outside of regular job time to work on these kinds of projects. And that's so I think you are role models. Tonight we'll be joined by Lydia Gaby, who's director at HR&A Advisors. Mike Harrington, as I mentioned, is the assistant director at the New School's Tishman Environment and Design Center. And Mallory Taub is associate at Gensler. And so if you guys want to take it over now, we're ready.
Thank you, Brian. And welcome everyone to our lecture this evening, Turning the Heat, Resiliency in New York City's Heat Vulnerable Neighborhoods. If we'll just pause on this first screen for a moment, just, want to thank everyone for taking the time to speak with us tonight. This is a really important topic, urban heat and heat danger, and that we're really, all three of us, very pleased to see it that over the past few years, with the impact of COVID-19 as well, has begun to really grab people's attention on a global and national stage. So for designers, planners, policymakers, and many more, this is a topic that we're happy to see getting more traction in the conversation. And we're looking forward to sharing with all of you this evening some of the things that, we, your hosts, have learned in our research on this topic. So one thing before we dive in that I want to note is that, we have some content that we'll be presenting to all of you as a more of a lecture style format, but we also want to make sure to have some open discussion during our session as well. So this is going to be a little bit more on the interactive side. And with that in mind, we'll ask that you feel free to use the chat box in Zoom at the bottom for any sort of thoughts, questions, things that come to your mind throughout our conversation as we get started. Next slide. So first for introductions, my name's Lydia Gaby. I'm a consultant working at HRNA Advisors, and we work primarily in the economic development and management consulting space. And I have a specific focus on race and climate forward planning. So bring a little bit of a different perspective in conversations about the built environment and impacts on community. And I'll turn it over to Mike and Mallory to introduce themselves quickly.
Yeah, like Brian said, I work at the New School as well. So I'm at the Tishman Environment Design Center, one of the assistant directors. And you can always reach out to me if you have any questions about this work. And yeah, I'm really happy to speak with you all, and happy to be working with Lydia and Mallory on presenting this.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Mallory. I am the Associate and Sustainability Specialist at Gensler, which is a large global design firm. Previous to working in sustainability and architecture, I had a very similar role at a global engineering firm and spent a lot of my time working on sustainability strategy, both for new building design and construction, as well as strategy documents for organizations across portfolios of buildings. And it's really been a real pleasure to learn from my co-presenters, as well as the rest of the cohort that was engaged in this research, which we'll tell you all about.
Thank you both. So let's get into content, but if any of you in the audience are interested to hear more about our companies, our practices, of course, feel free to reach out to us. So in terms of learning objectives for this evening, for today's lecture, we have a couple of specific things in mind for all of you. We're first going to describe some of the risk factors relating to extreme heat. Then we're going to articulate, what is heat resiliency as a justice and equity issue? How does this come into play, and how does it relate to some of the other conversations that we have all been having as a country about race and disparity? We're going to be highlighting some specific opportunities to minimize heat risk through 4 different pillars: design, policy, finance, and community resiliency. And lastly, we're going to be looking at some specific neighborhoods to try to start to identify strengths and opportunities to mitigate those extreme heat impacts. And this is where we're going to sort of be working with all of you in the interactive portion of our lecture this evening. So just to give ourselves a little bit of a roadmap, we're going to first do this first presentation that gives a little bit of context on what is extreme heat, how does it intersect with these topics of health and equity, and then we're going to shift over to our interactive discussion before sharing with you all some of our policy discussions and wrapping up. So first, a little bit about our fellowship process. So how did we conduct this research? We 3 met each other through a fellowship program called the Forefront Fellowship. It's a program that's run by the Urban Design Forum, which is a membership-based group or organization that's based in New York City. And their goal is to bring together professionals across New York City and the world who are professionals in very different professional spaces. Some of us were working in design and architecture, construction, engineering, real estate. I myself am more of an implementation and feasibility specialist, really different perspectives, but the Urban Design Forum's goal is to bring us together to talk about and grapple with some of these complex and interdisciplinary issues that we know characterize a lot of our world today. And so the goal of that organization is not just to share ideas, but also to develop and implement solutions as well. And our fellowship was a program to support young professionals sort of in these allied spaces and doing just that. The topic of our fellowship was for us to explore what are strategies that can be used to improve heat resiliency for residents and the neighbors who are most at risk. We were 25, again, this diverse cohort representing architecture, engineering, construction industry, lots of other different fields. And in the way that we conducted this work, we did field studies. We did a lot of site visits going around New York City into different boroughs, through tours and discussion with people in different spaces. We conducted interviews with people in New York City and around the world who are at the vanguard of thinking about what's possible to address urban heat. And how can we address urban heat, address social vulnerability, and build resilience overall? And also, we were conducting our own desktop research, connecting the dots between what we see in our own experience in our own professions and what we think can be done, where's the next places to go in this space. And all of this was conducted under a partnership that we were supporting with the New York City Office of Resiliency. And so it's a mayoral office, and we were supporting them to say, you all are implementing some of the policies that you all already have in hand. What can we do as fellows to sort of accelerate your work with some additional ideas and to bring in some new concepts from around the world? And so we'll be sharing with you all today 40 interdisciplinary recommendations. You'll be receiving access to this link that's listed here on the bottom for some more information. And an entire report was compiled to summarize a lot of what we found through this process, and we'll be touching on some of the higher level dimensions from what we found today. So next, to dive in, we first have an icebreaker for all of you. And our question is, what is a time when you have personally experienced extreme heat? And within that, what aspects of the built environment either worsened or mitigated the impact? So this is an opportunity for you to use the Zoom chat to think a little bit about how have you in your own life seen the impacts of heat on yourself? Some of the things that I think about on this topic are, for instance, you may have been living in a house that had really terrible window insulation. And what are some of the things that you do, if that were the case to keep your house or your home cool? Or maybe if you were outside, I know that when I was growing up, one of the tricks that I had was to put a damp washcloth on your forehead. And that's one of the ways that we managed, heat when I was growing up. So, as we go through some of these slides, what are some of the things that you have felt in your cities that made you realize that you were experiencing extreme heat, and what did you do about it? So with that, I'll ask that as an icebreaker challenge to all of you, and I'll also hand it over to Mike to get into some of our next slides.
All right, thank you, Lydia. And yeah, make sure to put your thanks for putting your heat experiences in there. We'll take a look, and we'll hopefully be able to respond to some of that. And this slide, we're just going to talk about the extreme heat risk in New York. Although this photo here is actually one of my experiences with extreme heat. When I was a little boy, there was a terrible heat wave in Chicago that killed about 800 people in like a week and a half. And it was like really extreme. And I even like almost had to go to the hospital, but it was terrifying. And that photo is actually from that time there that you see. Those are Chicago police, unfortunately, removing bodies after the heat. But to give you all some context, in New York City, And this is very similar in other large cities, but extreme heat is on average the most fatal of all extreme weather events. More than hurricanes, except for Hurricane Katrina, more than floods, more than tornadoes. Like in New York, there's about 115 excess deaths from heat, about 450 heat-related ER visits, and a lot of hospital admissions, like almost 150 of those. And by the 2050s, it's going to get worse because the annual average temperatures are projected to increase by between 4 and about 5.7 degrees Fahrenheit. And by the 2080s, the frequency of heat waves, where there's more than 3 days of extreme heat, is expected to triple. So in this section, we're just going to talk about some of the risk factors. And then we're going to have Lydia and Mallory and I will have a bit of a discussion about some of the things that we found interesting, or some of the things that we thought about during this, when we were investigating extreme heat. So for vulnerability and built environment factors, neighborhoods with hotter daytime surface temperatures and less green space are more prone to extreme heat. So think about places that you see, even in New York, where if there's a lot of trees and stuff, it's not going to be as hot. But if you go to a place like a neighborhood where there's less tree cover, less vegetation, you'll notice it's a lot warmer there. And you can actually measure that. Land use adjacency, such as proximity to highways or industrial areas, also heighten surface temperatures. And that's another thing we see in New York. If you look at the areas like, for instance, in Williamsburg by the BQE, you see like probably higher temperatures and worse air quality. Poor insulation and leaky building envelopes can make cooling very difficult and costly. So insulation, air sealing, that sort of stuff is not just for winter, it's also for heating, like in the summer. And only about 75% of New Yorkers have residential air conditioning, and not everyone who has an air conditioner can afford to use it, or which is a huge problem. So Mallory and Lydia, I wanted to know if there's any things about the built environment that stuck out to you, either when we were learning about this or that you already knew.
Well, one thing I can just point out that I'm seeing a little bit in the chat here as people sort of point out is the pedestrian experience. I think one of the things that the three of us all kind of noted as we were doing our site visits around New York City is not just the interior usage or use case for residential air conditioning to keep the homes cool, but the impact to pedestrians of wide-scale use of air conditioners. And I just remember walking past buildings and sort of feeling the heat, even while I'm outside, as an offset sort of factor. So just wanted to make the point that, all of these systems have, multiple dimensions of how, they're experienced and interact with our overall, thermodynamics across the city.
Yeah, I think we were looking at one study that during a heat wave, this might have been specific to New York City, but in an urban environment, about 10% of the heat in the air is from air conditioners. So the air conditioning units rejecting the heat, as Lydia was mentioning, all just making the outdoor temperature that much hotter and more miserable. I think something that I really noticed was that during our visits to different neighborhoods, just how drastically different it felt depending on which neighborhood you were in. You could really feel it. The same afternoon, we would be in one area and it would feel really different, much hotter. Something like this photo where there's no shade, everything is tarmac. It was that noticeable. Same city, same afternoon. You can really feel the difference.
And yeah, that's a good segue into more of the social factors that we see that contribute to heat. So thanks for bringing it up, Mallory. So yeah, some of the social factors that we look at, and this is a picture of a cooling center, and we'll talk more about those later. But populations that are at risk for heat often have other vulnerabilities, and we found that in New York, and again, this is true in a lot of other places. Income is a risk factor. So neighborhoods where households receive more public assistance. You tend to see more heat-related illnesses, deaths, and things like that there. Race, one of the biggest predictors, unfortunately, was being Black, like non-Latino Black New Yorkers. And that was also the case during that terrible Chicago heat wave where all those people died. Most of them were older. So age is a big heat factor, and health. So pre-existing health factors like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and now COVID is a heat risk factor. So and speaking of COVID, all these things that we're looking at, those are also risk factors for COVID. So these things link up. And it's, I'm sure if we looked at the maps, it would probably be very close to the heat maps. But what did you all think of some of the social factors, or what really stuck out to you all about that?
I think I'd start with just a re-emphasis of something you said earlier on, Mike, about how this is the biggest killer of all the extreme weather events. And, you know, when I first learned that, it makes sense, but it's surprising. You know, I think a lot of people, when they think about the impacts of climate change, they'll think of things like extreme weather events such as hurricanes, typhoons, and you know, things to do with precipitation and water. But urban heat is the biggest killer. It's just that it's unseen. You know, you don't see the danger as it's applied, especially while people are really suffering and going through, you know, this heat risk while they're inside their own apartments. It's its own silent killer, and that has made it really difficult to build awareness and support for different types of solutions and interventions that can address it. So I wanted to just emphasize that it's a huge problem, and it has to date not received the same amount of attention, and in large part because, you know, the folks who are experiencing this are unseen by those who are in power to create the momentum behind solutions that would really have a meaningful impact.
Mallory, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got the image of it on the next slide, but New York City is unique in the way that heat risk has been mapped across the city to look at both the actual temperatures and these risk factors, and looking at where these neighborhoods are spatially. I think particularly as professionals working in the built environment, and we're really used to looking at maps, the data is there. It's spatialized. We can see the neighborhoods that have this. And I think Mike's going to talk about that a little bit more, but this is something that in New York City, there's all sorts of data and maps if you want to look at this further at the neighborhood level. And I that wasn't something I knew about before this fellowship.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, thank you, Mallory and Lydia. And yeah, that it is something I think I knew before. And I remember when we did the fellowship, like when we talked about this. So like looking at this, so formerly redlined areas. And for those of you who don't know what redlining is, in a nutshell, it's the practice of basically restricting where people could live, usually based on race, across the United States of America. So a lot of those unfortunate policies still stand up today, and it's still very difficult for people, especially Black, Latinx people, to move out of those formerly redlined neighborhoods. And there's a lot of reasons for that we don't have time to get into. But in those areas in New York, the land surface temperature could be as much as 7 degrees Celsius hotter than non-redlined areas, which is huge. That's something that you can, like, you know, we've all like what Mallory just said, like she's actually felt it. She's walked, you know, when we were doing our fellowship, walking around, you can feel the difference. And the 12 New York City neighborhoods with the highest heat vulnerability just happen to be low income and predominantly communities of color, very similar to what Lydia said, like the people that those in power aren't really paying attention to, you know, and making sure that they're safe. So yeah, it's a huge equity issue. It is a huge environmental justice issue, and it's good that there is more conversation about it, but I know there could be more about it. So I just wanted to see, before we get to our discussion, was there anything else that you all, Lydia or Mallory, wanted to share?
I think the last point that I'd make is just that this is really a people problem. And so, in all of the conversations that I had with people around the world focusing on addressing urban heat, you go into those places, but those who have financial resources have things like central cooling. They have things like, the ability to create a habitable space for themselves. And so when we're talking about an issue like this, even though we know a lot of the things that are already constructed in the environment are it's about materials and buildings and how are we constructing and reconstructing our space. But I wanted to just, reemphasize that this is the vulnerability shows up in people and the way that they're living their lives. And that's human behavior is an important dimension as we think about what to do about it, because we can intervene on the physical side of this. We can also intervene in how people themselves are experiencing the space around them and what resources they have to go to a different space or to stay in place, but have a different experience in the space that are available to them.
And yeah, I know you talked about this before, Mallory, as I switched the slide. So if you don't like, if there's any is there any last minute thing you wanted to share before we start bringing everyone else into the discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I feel like just working in architecture, it's difficult because these are neighborhood level challenges and not just built environment challenges. And it can be difficult on a singular project to try and convince people of implementing certain strategies, but and we'll probably talk more about the interdisciplinary nature of all of this, but it's really how so many different decisions come together to create these decisions, and each part has to nudge forward in some way to completely change the conditions. These are not things that have a quick fix or a quick change, which I think is part of the reason why that we've ended up in the place that we've been.
Oh yeah, it's a great and sobering point. I wanted to get a little bit into our interactive discussion. So we're going to talk about two scenarios, and we're going to talk about it at different levels. And then we'll talk about these for about 10 minutes each. And we really want to hear from you all. We want this to be a discussion more than a lecture. So you're welcome to turn on your camera and unmute. You can use the chat if you want, but we really want this to be more of an interactive thing where you all are sharing what your knowledge and your thoughts with us. And so these are the two scenarios we're going to be looking at, just to give you a preview. The first one's going to be, and these are very supposed to be prototypes. So cities like this, these are things that you could find in most cities around the world, but we wanted to look at two different typologies of cities. So we have a city similar to, our first scenario is going to be the Bronx, where it's hot and humid like New York, very urban. And our second one's going to be more suburban, Arizona, if you've ever been there, very dry, very hot year round, very lots of concrete. So yeah, with that, we are going to jump into our discussion, and I think I'm going to be shifting it off to, is it going to be Mallory for Lydia or Mallory to talk about the Bronx, the first part of the Bronx?
I'll go first. So thanks everyone for being willing to jump into discussion with us. For this first scenario, as Mike was describing, we're going to be talking about the Bronx. And so if you look toward the bottom of your screen, those are the discussion questions that are really the prompt for us to get into with each other today. We have the scenario in front of us, a particular typology that we'll do a little bit of describing, but what we want to talk about with all of you all is a couple of specific things. We have a family highlighted here at the bottom, and if you'll sort of direct your eyes to the lines at the left, you can see that what we're intending to display here is that this is the family and the unit of their apartment. It's situated within that multifamily building structure on this streetscape. And our questions are, what would make this family uncomfortable living here in a hot summer? What are some of the things that we can begin to name and note are contributing to urban heat, that are increasing the temperature and making them less able to manage that. So what would make this family feel uncomfortable living here in a hot summer? What do you think could be some of the actions that they take to feel more comfortable when it's hot outside? You know, what are the things that they can do? And thirdly, are there tools or resources that they have in their unit, in their building, or in the neighborhood that can help? And our last question is, have you experienced any of these risk factors in other locations? So we started this conversation already, where you all are naming how you have felt this in your experience of cities around the world. You know, what are you naming here that resonates with you to say, yeah, when I was sort of living here, experiencing that, that really resonates with me. And so in my part of the discussion, I'm going to start off with just a little bit of orientation. Again, this is the Bronx in New York City. It's hot and really humid in the summer. We're looking here at a cross section of a streetscape. And I'd like to begin our discussion first talking about the characteristics of the neighborhood. When you're looking at this cross section of, you know, how it feels to walk around, to get around this particular neighborhood, you're seeing a couple of different, you know, people and vehicles in this scene. Is there anything that you all in the audience are able to name to say, well, this part of how the neighborhood is constructed is contributing to heat? This is making it hotter or not making it cooler. Is there anything that you all can name in the picture? And feel free to use the chat or to directly unmute yourself and get into the discussion. Seeing lack of green space, definitely. That's definitely a contributing factor here. And you're seeing that in the, you know, there aren't any trees noted or anything that through the process of evapotranspiration would be able to cool down the surrounding environment. So not having that is definitely a major contributor to the heat here. Dark color surfaces, again, another reason why, you know, we're sucking in the heat that is coming from the sun, and it allows for this neighborhood to get hot and to stay hot late into the evening and the afternoon. Vehicles and the prevalence of vehicles in this area are definitely a contributing factor. And I think one other thing is that when you've got a lot of vehicles and you've got a lot of traffic, it also makes it less hospitable to pedestrians. And so people who would normally be going outside, you know, like think about what that does when you've got a busy street. We can breathe, but we'll be breathing all the heat. Yep. I'm setting aside the comments on specific aspects of the building because we're going to get into that with Mallory next. But I think we saw one comment about the height of the buildings and the shade that's provided by those taller buildings, because that does play a role in how hot you are feeling when you're walking around the streetscape. Definitely, yes. Like one other thing to note about that is you can see the interplay between the two buildings, how they're spaced apart. The effect of that and how it creates wind tunnels or changes and alters the wind circulation of a neighborhood, that also has a really big impact of how it feels in the, you know, when you're walking around or in the street pedestrian environment. Lots of concrete, definitely. Okay, I think we've named a lot about the characteristics of the neighborhood. Mallory, do you want to pick up on some of the aspects of the buildings themselves that might contribute to heat?
Yeah, definitely. So here we're looking at multifamily buildings, 5 or more stories. I only just noticing now that the box where the section cut, probably the level above, probably not the ground floor, likely to be retail spot. So in your heads, just be kind and bump that box up one floor to, let's say, the second floor unit. These are probably old buildings with pretty low insulation. You know, people have been noting so far that, you know, there aren't any exterior window shades. I saw that one come up in the chat. maybe this is a place that has a whole bunch of security cameras, maybe some no trespassing signs. So maybe people can picture themselves in a location like this. So what are some aspects related to the building design that you think are also increasing the vulnerability to heat? I did see that the arcade for the shade for the ground floor that is really effective. I remember interning a really long time ago with a friend from Beirut, and she said that type of arcade was just throughout her whole neighborhood as a way to provide shaded walkways, which I thought was really beautiful to imagine. Also, see a comment up in the chat about unclear if the window's open. Cross breeze may be helpful. Yeah, that can also completely be a factor. Are these really big floor plates? Is it a double loaded corridor? Maybe if you're in the corner unit, you can get some breeze going window to window, but sometimes in really large buildings that can be difficult to get that cross ventilation, even if the window's open. We've got an Instagram link.
I think one thing that came up earlier on in the chat, Mallory, is a couple of people made note of how hot it was to navigate transportation. Right here we're seeing someone sitting under a shelter waiting for the bus or some form of transit, likely the bus. People sitting in traffic. I think one of the major things that everyone experiences navigating cities is when you're outdoors, you're not necessarily just walking down the street, you're interacting with these systems of transportation, and they however well that's managed, the materials that are used to construct those, the wind and air environments that are around you, either when you're sitting at a bus shelter or on a bus, that also has an impact on your body for the rest of that day, and in some cases the rest of the week. So just wanted to bring back in that piece about transportation too, as we sort of think about what's contributing to discomfort here.
Definitely. Mike, do you want to transition into talking about different risk factors associated with people in this scenario?
Oh, sure. And yeah, people keep sending your thoughts about this, even if we are on like the household. But so if you look at the bottom, this is a cross section of one of the units in this apartment building on the left. And there's an elderly person there, and she's in a wheelchair. This is a grandmother and her grandson, who is an asthmatic. And as you can see, they have quite a small apartment. There's not a lot of amenities. There's no air conditioner. The grandmother does not speak English. That is not her first language. So she has some limited, some language barriers. And the boy is about 15 years old, asthmatic. They live on a fixed income and in a rent control unit that has not been renovated in over 15 years. They have an old air conditioner. It's very old, so not that efficient. There's a fridge, there's a shower and bathroom, but they don't have a tub. And their unit faces south and has one window in the living room. They do have access to water. So again, so what are some of looking at those questions, what is something that would make these people uncomfortable? What can they do to be more comfortable? And what is in that unit that could help them or like hinder? So what are the challenges some of these people would face? Let's check the chat. And I know for this, like the limited mobility is like definitely one. It can be very difficult for people living, south facing window, have a shade. Yeah, that's a good one. What else?
Someone brought up, cross ventilation. So thinking about, how are you able to open up both of those windows so that you can get some of that cross going?
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, no, cross ventilation. So that's a huge one. Anything else? Any other risk factors or other things that would be helpful? Fan, yeah, fan could help. And these are like really like a lot of social things going on. Yeah, no window shading. Yeah, nothing there. So so the air is just there for just sitting there basically. And they're just sitting there stifling in this heat. And I don't know if this will come up later, but it doesn't even need to be that hot to be a risk. It can be like 85 degrees. And that's hot enough. If it's 85 degrees for a few days and you don't get any respite, that's quite dangerous, especially for an older person and an asthmatic. And again, these are the same risk factors that we see for a lot of things, including the pandemic. So yeah, we can, I think we can
I want to point just a couple of the things to note. So when we're thinking about people who are living, who are, less able to move around, they have mobility challenges, then, when we think about some of the things that are recommendations, like get outside, it's going to be a little bit harder for this grandmother to take those types of actions. And so, what does it look like for her in this space when, she's differently able or not able to take advantage of some of those as solutions? I'll also point out, in a lot of communities of color, people who are coming from different places or don't really have, like one example, they don't understand, thermodynamics. I've got lots of examples of people that I know who, when let's say they were younger, would do things like they'll open the freezer and, they'll think that I really need to cool down. I'm going to open the freezer and that's going to cool me down. And I think if any of you all know better, that actually heats up your apartment because of the energy that's required to produce that cooling effect. But I bring that up because in the way that we design these environments, we have to understand that people are going to use them in the way that they're able, in the way that they understand. And some of those snap decisions they make, are in some ways can contribute to the harmful scenario that they're facing. And so, some of the things that they might do with the water that's available to them, with the, the freezer that's available to them, opening the fridge. It doesn't necessarily help, but it's something that we need to understand as we design and plan for another way for them to experience the space.
Thanks, Lydia. And we have a second scenario, and I think we can maybe go through it a little bit quicker, just so we don't take up too much of everyone's time. But our second one is more suburban, like I said, Tempe, Arizona. And so it's like, yeah, the same sort of questions.
Right. And we can start with the characteristics again of the neighborhood. As you all are looking at this example, is there anything that you can point out that, is contributing to heat here? Maybe it was this, some of the similar things that are at play in as in New York, or things that are new here. Air pollution index outside triggering asthma or under air. Yep, that's definitely another thing that happens. Buildings seem more exposed. They're definitely, we're showing here single story buildings. And so, as we were talking about in the last example with larger, taller buildings that, it has a different relationship to the street, provides less shade. They're more exposed to sun. There's less, insulations available. So they're definitely more exposed, and that has a different feeling inside and outside the building.
Oh, yeah, maybe we can quickly talk about the characteristics of the building. So maybe one or two things about that.
Yeah, so in these we've got central air conditioning. That's one of the things that for some of the homes in the West that were built more recently, a lot were built with central AC, but still often have low levels of insulation. And you can see here that there are some overhangs, but you can also see that there's an attic space up there that can also be a challenge for heat accumulating. So some really good things also coming into the chat. So opening it back up around what are some of the aspects about the design of the building that are helping or hurting.
So yeah, no permeable surface, no shade. And then I can quickly tell, like we can talk about the people that live here. So they're an elderly, middle income Black couple. One has severe arthritis and mobility issues. The other is a cancer survivor, but still has to work to earn extra income. They have some weekly house maintenance, but not a lot, like lawn stuff. And their children and family members don't live close. And there have been water shortages in their city where usage is restricted in the summer, which is something that is unfortunately very common in the western parts of the United States. So what are some risk factors out of what we've talked about? Just share a couple in the chat. Roof adds to heating, solar exposure. Yeah, that's a really good point. So if there's a way to basically isolate that part of the envelope, and that will not only make the home cooler, it'll lower their bills since they are middle income. They don't have a lot of disposable income. What else? What's one more thing that's good or bad for this couple, or that would make it difficult? You can keep going in the chat about this, but we just wanted to talk about our interdisciplinary approach on dealing with these issues. And yeah, you can keep going in the chat, like I said, about all these other scenarios as well.
Yeah, so the report that we developed is broken up into these 4 sections: ideas and recommendations for design, for policy, for finance, and community resiliency. So we are not going to be able to cover all 40 of our recommendations, but we wanted to share a sampling of them, and also share some of the ones that we thought were particularly exciting or surprising as we were going through. So the first one we're going to start with is design. So for design, we got into a bit of detail around existing buildings. I think that's one of the things in architecture school that was maybe a little different for me. There's a lot of, or something I really felt like I had to think about. There's a lot of focus on the design of new buildings and new spaces, but from a sustainability perspective, there are way more existing buildings than there are new buildings, and really looking at the existing building stock as the greatest opportunity for making a climate impact. And specifically when it comes to heat, there are several different ways to address the envelope, whether that's from looking at the insulation, and other upgrades that would relate to providing healthy environments. And really the envelope, one of the shocking things is how much that impacts the heat transfer from the outdoor temperature to the indoor temperature. And Lydia, I think there was something you wanted to mention about some studies we were learning about indoor temperatures versus outdoor temperatures.
Well, I think one of the things that I wanted to talk about actually is that, there's Mike brought up earlier on in this call that, even a temperature of around 85 degrees, if that's prolonged, can be dangerous to your health. And so, with that in mind, there's a lot of things that we can do to the larger building envelope to improve the situation, but there are also things that we can do tomorrow that are more along the lines of, working within our existing units and apartments to make some really quick changes for people that you may know, or sort of are in the community that, what can they do today? What can they do really simply? And some of those things are as simple as making sure to add some window covering or some window treatment to stop some of the light from coming in and making your unit that much hotter. It's really, really cheap as a solution. And a lot of people don't realize that just closing your drapes, closing your shades can limit some of the heat that's coming in. Some of the things around, making sure that your air conditioner is clean. I don't want to overlook the fact that it's how the building is constructed, but it's also how the building is managed and maintained, and how people are using the apartments and the units themselves to make sure that they are doing what they can, even with limited financial resources, to lower the indoor temperature.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. And yeah, in this slide, we talk about external shading devices. So when I was in architecture school, I had these great classes around daylighting where we learned about solar geometry and how to properly size an overhang for different locations and different times of year. But then going into practice, the outside of buildings are almost always flat. And from a thermodynamics perspective, you want the heat to stay outside. You don't want that solar heat gain to come inside. So the shades and the covering inside is a great and easier way to try and make an immediate impact on the temperature of the environment. But as design students, to think about really how you shape that external wall. And even from a product design perspective, as a retrofit strategy, Manhattan's on a 22-degree angle. There are many buildings that have that exact same solar orientation. I always thought it would be cool to design a retrofit application sunshade that had a really unique geometry to that particular exposure, solar exposure, that could just be kind of applied throughout the facades with that solar exposure. So I would definitely challenge the product designers out there to think about retrofit applications that are creative and beautiful and shade the sun. So moving into policy, we had a number of people in our cohort that worked for the city. And so this was definitely an area where I feel like I learned a lot from the other people in the fellowship. We came up with a few ideas. And so these are a few ideas that relate to the communication of heat wave events, naming heat wave events, how the heat wave communications are managed through emergency alerts, and leveraging existing alerts that are out there to include notification about heat. So we were just talking before this with Lydia and Mike, and how your phone, or at least my phone or our phones, starts going crazy when there's a flash flood warning, and it vibrates, it's like blinking at you, and there's that sense of emergency and danger. And that's an existing alert mechanism that could be used during heat events to really communicate the risk and the threat of the heat waves to people. Similarly, that there's existing ways to put notifications on those Link NYC units throughout the city. And I think the heat wave events was an idea that I think has picked up a lot of traction and a lot of enthusiasm. I think, Lydia, did you want to talk about that one at all?
I think that on the next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the idea here where, one of the things that we learned through this fellowship is that while there are regulations around heating, particularly in New York City, and with the interest of making sure that you've got a habitable indoor space for the cold winter months, we've got a lot of policy and regulation around requirements on building managers and landlords to have a minimum temperature that is considered habitable, but we don't have an indoor building temperature limit on the maximum side. And we don't establish these kinds of thresholds for maximum allowable heat rejection. And one of the things that, we were thinking about as we sort of took this on is that, it would be really powerful to set some of these standards and, find ways to enforce them either through sensors and measurement, or, how we can go about that to ensure that the interiors that we're designing are habitable spaces in both the cold weather months and the warm weather months, because as we've been discussing, urban heat is one of the biggest killers. And so, if it's a hole in our regulation that we can address both in our design and management, as well as to advocate for in the policy landscape.
Okay, so moving into finance, we had a few ideas that related to solar panels. For a lot of buildings, my own building included, the first cost of installing solar on the roof is prohibitive. And solar can be helpful because it can also provide backup power in the event of a blackout. And there are solar developers out there that pay for all of the first costs, or where you can actually lease your rooftop space to solar developers. But a lot of them aren't very interested in smaller buildings. You know, they want to go where there's a really big building. So maybe there's creative and innovative ways for several small buildings to band together, or to just think a little bit more creatively about how PV can be integrated into building design as a potential resource during heat wave events.
And there's something I'd like to add to this as well. When you look at like so many homes, I think about it's about half or about less than half of homes cannot have solar on the roof. So it's something that a lot of people could be left out unless you look at community shared solar. So working with neighborhood groups, and I think Uprose is basically doing this in Brooklyn. They're working with a larger group to create community shared solar. But there's also a policy component to this, where for developers, they get a huge tax credit, but that will end, I think, next year. So they're set to end 2023. So they were extended. They were supposed to end this year, and they were extended this year till next year. But one of the things that I think is important is like being able to extend those tax credits so that there is financing available from developers to do these solar projects.
Also, I love Uprose as well. One of the greatest honors that I've had at work is getting to invite Elizabeth Jean-Pierre to speak to us and to facilitate her lecture to our staff. Really, if you don't know them, check them out. Yeah, again, a huge fan. So there's also some recommendations that we were looking at related to PACE. And we also spent some time talking about different co-op and ownership models. I think the Uprose example is a great one. I think in Sunset Park, it's either the first or the largest community-owned community solar development. And so really, I think if you want to get into different finance mechanisms, there are some examples of cool things going on, and I think a lot of potential for further innovation in this area. Okay, so lastly, we have community resiliency. And several of our recommendations have to do with cooling centers. And so a cooling center is a place that will have air conditioning during a heat wave. So if your apartment is really hot or you don't have power, you can go to a cooling center and get relief from heat. But if you can imagine yourself being in a really hot apartment, are you really going to mobilize and motivate to get to a cooling center? You know, maybe not if you don't know anybody there, or you've never been, or maybe have some preconception thoughts about what that place will be like. And so we talked about how those cooling centers could be places that have really cool programming going on, or things that are part of your life and part of your community outside of those emergency events.
And I remember when we were doing our research, one thing that really stuck out to me that was kind of funny is when they asked people who were up there in age, like why they don't like going to cooling centers. They were like at a senior center, they were like, well, there's a bunch of old people there. We don't want to be around, like we don't want to be around people our age. So I think it is really important that for cooling centers, there's something that you're already familiar with, or a place you're already familiar with, and a place that has things to do. Because if you look at the photo that we showed earlier, There was basically, there were just people sitting at tables. Like there was no entertainment. There was like nothing to do. So I think it's really important that we make these, like Mallory was saying and Lydia said, we have to make these places engaging and places that people want to go to, instead of just like an empty room with like some, you know, bottles of water and nothing else.
Okay, and this is our last slide of recommendations, and this is a really fun one, just not just a fun one to say, but a fun one to think about as creatives. So this is deploy cool down pop-ups. So think of this as, you know, pop-up temporary installations or activations that provide relief from heat. So maybe it's cold water, maybe it's providing ice cream. Somebody else who's a landscape architect in our team thought, what if it was a deployable forest, and, you know, a large flatbed truck with all sorts of greenery and shade to come on in. So I think that as people in design, you probably have way more creative ideas than perhaps we do, but to really think of pop-ups as an opportunity for a way to reach people during these times of heat waves. What would it look like? What would it be made out of? What would it provide that would relieve heat? And you know, how could that instantly, you know, change the whole dynamic of that neighborhood block when the cool down pop-up rolls into town?
All right, so yeah, we're getting basically to the end of our presentation, and I wanted to share some of the key takeaways that we hope you got from this session. The first was that addressing heat resiliency in the built environment, it has to go hand in hand with social vulnerability, because, you know, I know you all are designers, but and architects, but like, yeah, the building is important, but what about the people that building serves? What about the people that live in that building? What about the neighborhood around that building? So I think you have to look at this in a larger context when you're dealing with urban heat. And also tackling heat resiliency, it requires interdisciplinary action between building design and construction professionals, policymakers, community members and leaders, and other people. And yeah, we might be leaving someone out. So if you want to share that in the chat, feel free to. And what can you do today? You can, if you live in New York City, you can advocate to your local council member or your elected officials that heat resiliency is an important issue. You can even write to your state, federal council member, representatives as well. But we did want to encourage you to ask any questions. So this is we'll share like the report and all this stuff here, and this is our contact info, but we wanted to know if you have any like questions that were on your mind. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask, and we're happy to answer them. But otherwise, thank you all for joining us today.
No, this is Brian. Thank you guys so much. While people are thinking about their questions, maybe I can just pull out, you know, my highlights too. I mean, I really appreciated like when Lydia mentioned, because we're so used to thinking about flood risk and it's so visible, you know, when it comes, and Lydia said this is the invisible risk, and of course the more deadlier one, and so it's harder to see, and I just want to underline that, but we can feel it. And so as an architect, as a designer, I'm you know, of course, how all our senses are engaged in design is really important. And so you know, I'm like frustrated, like it's so easy, you know, because I you know, grew up and never had air conditioning, and living in the Lower East Side, which is a red-lined heat wave zone, and then moving to Newark Ironbound, which is a red-lined, you know, intense heat hotspot. for not only social reasons, but they're old swamps and they're parts of the city. You go to the Hudson River if you want some cool air, but then really so you sort of we're humans. We have these senses which tell us, okay, pull the shade, open the window. The sun rises here and sets there, and in winter it sets over here, and summer it's over here. And I'm in Arizona. It's really cool at night, and the ground is keeping that coolness. And I want to build an adobe and use that. Or I'm in the tropics somewhere. I mean, if you look at the architecture before air conditioning comes in, it's incredibly inventive, and they always have water and vegetation in relationship to verandas and covered spaces. And so we have this knowledge, we have this, it comes from our bodies, it comes from our senses. But then, I was really struck when you had your case studies of, the grandmother in the wheelchair with the asthmatic grandson, and I'm like, yeah, what are they gonna do? And so so for me, I really was struck by the pop-up idea and the community idea, because I think for me, I mean, in the work I've been doing is really trying to get out of the building unit and think of the block unit. And so like Mallory was saying, with the 22-degree orientation of the Manhattan block in relationship to north-south. I mean, every block in the Bronx or Brooklyn and things. I mean, we all have these blocks everywhere. And if as a block, where your hot spots and your cool spots are. Every block has a cool spot in it as well as a hot spot in it, because it has 4 orientations and breezes from different directions. And so you don't have to go to these boring, air-conditioned centers. You can, have something in a shared backyard or someone's roof or, someone's basement even, which is cool. And so I just really think this is such a great call to action. I'm just wondering, because, my knowledge as an architect is so specific, and it is so conditional on the specific place and like the building type that you show in South Bronx. I know building types in South Bronx. An apartment building is H. They have courtyards in the front. They have this sort of pre-air conditioning natural ventilation system built into them already, versus the row house in the West Village versus the tenement, which is of course hotter on the Lower East Side. And so, I mean, it's way specific knowledge. And so how do you take these general, very informative things and really start to take action at the block scale? I think that, at the scale of the block. Do you have any thoughts about further implementation or action, or even making a pop-up?
I mean, for action, and I think Mallory and we worked on this with for our second part. So we did all of us had to do a second part that we didn't even touch on, like basically a second project where we looked at something that we thought was interesting. So the team I was on, and Pallavi, who wasn't able to join us, was also on this team. We looked at like zoning, basically like allowing people to live in areas, making it easier for people to live in areas that had already been that have very low climate and heat risk. So allowing basically low and moderate income to live in a place like NoHo, Soho, and facilitating that through incentives and putting pressure on city council members to make it so that people can move to parts of the city that have lower climate risk. Now we do think all of the cities should be able to be safe and have low climate risks, but right now that is not the case. And it's very prohibitive to move to places with low climate risk. So that's one small thing. And that does have a lot of challenges to it as well, like social challenges. But I think it was more, I think we were thinking more like some places are overburdened and other places have less burden. So we need to equalize that burden and like share, basically make it so that people are sharing space that is more safe and more in places that have like less heat and climate risk. So that's one thing that we did on my second team that I worked on.
Yeah, and if you're thinking about designing a pop-up, I mean, I think one of the great positions that you're in at the School of Constructed Environments is that somebody at the start of this listed all the different departments in the school, and it would just be really in terms of, you know, each department or, you know, each track, you really have a depth in that particular field, but you know, forming a team across all the departments, having one person at least from each team, you just learn so much from each other, and then the design becomes that much richer as a result. But I feel like a big part of this fellowship for the second project, I was on Mike's team. We spent almost all of our meetings just bouncing around different ideas, and people from one discipline would say, oh, well, this would be a challenge, or this would be an opportunity. And I really think that kind of getting out of our silos and working on the same team with people from other disciplines is really important for looking at these types of complex problems.
I guess the only thing that I can add to this conversation about pop-ups is, you know, just to build on what Mallory is saying about interdisciplinary action. One of the things that we've seen a lot of with COVID is the reliance on partnerships to move quickly and to make decisions that are responsive to community need. And so finding community partners like business improvement districts or groups that really are embedded in the community, and, you know, let's say working with small business owners and folks who are on the streetscape, or other community groups, you know, how can we identify a pop-up design that responds to what people specifically in that area say that they want and need? You know, how are we connecting our thinking and design process with what is the community discourse that's underway, and kind of designing in a way that is instead of being a top-down, I'm going to come up with a solution and apply that to you, you know, how are we building those solutions together? And through the process, building an understanding with the community about these topics of risk and resiliency, because we know that that's an underlying train of conversation that we need to continue. So just want to emphasize the importance of not just interdisciplinary action, but also partnerships in the community as you think about those types of interventions.
And we got a really good comment from Rebecca about, you know, existing buildings, you know, not just thinking about having to escape them in extreme heat to go to a cooling center, but, you know, what can you really do? And Mike put some strategies in around air sealing and insulation. I mean, one of the things that is going on for my apartment building, it's a pre-war building, and it doesn't have air conditioning, and our heating system is ancient. It's original to the building, and it's an 1875 building. Not the kind of thing original to the building that you really want. And so one of the things that we're doing is we're replacing our fuel oil boiler with a heat pump system, and that heat pump system is connected to a VRF heating system that will provide both heating and cooling to the space. And we worked it out that the new system will be so much less in maintenance and repairs, and so much less for fuel costs, that we think once the system is in, we'll be able to save money going forward. So I do think our building is not unique, and that there's a large number of multifamily existing buildings that their heating system is due to be replaced. And so I do think that there's an opportunity there to switch over to heat pump systems. And somebody did bring up the problem with financing, and I'm happy to talk about more with anybody who's interested how we're doing it with my building. But there are also some great reports through the Building Energy Exchange about this type of switch to the system for the heating and cooling system. And just kind of in general in design, all of our building codes are designed around being a heating dominant climate. But in New York City right now, we're, you know, becoming a cooling dominant climate, and what are the implications on design for that. So not necessarily a whole bunch of satisfying answers. It is really hard, but there are different things that you can do. And one of the things that the city's been doing for a long time is the Cool Roof program, and that's probably one of the easiest and lowest cost options that provides actually a pretty significant impact, is retrofitting rooftops with white paint that's highly reflective. That's something that in the design of new buildings, looking at the solar reflectance of that surface is important. But I mean, even on BBC Today, I was watching an article in India about providing a reflective white paint to the roofs of buildings in a community there, and how much of an impact that meant to be able to sleep on that surface and also walk on that surface. And then it wasn't as hot for the top unit up above. So there are things that are out there, and it's a bit of a process to figure out what's possible for each scenario. There's just so many different factors.
Mm-hmm. And I think the only thing I'd add along this line is if you center the folks who are at the highest degree of risk here, a lot of these challenges around financing or navigating these processes become that much more difficult. And because, let's say, if you're looking at folks who are living under extreme levels of poverty or sort of near and around the poverty line, let's say they're living in buildings that are very old and are not very well maintained, you know, what can we do in those types of spaces to try and improve the situation? And I'd encourage any of you who are interested in looking a little bit further into this topic to look into what the Mayor's Office of Resiliency is taking on as their strategy. One of the highest impact interventions that they chose to do to really get to those people who are in immediate danger is to subsidize the cost of purchasing air conditioners and to increase access to air conditioning in that way. There are, you know, really interesting trade-offs between some of the larger climate and, you know, resiliency goals that we have to reduce our reliance on things like air conditioners. But, you know, how does that sit in relation to our desire to help support and protect those who are facing the most danger right now due to no fault of their own? One particular just example or narrative around that is we were speaking to residents who are living in public housing developments across the city, and someone had mentioned that because of the way that the legal structure and contracts for their apartments work, if they were to invest in an air conditioner, that would qualify as an improvement. And when it qualifies an improvement, it has a lot of other implications to their personal financial situation, what they're eligible to, the cost of their rent, et cetera. And so you've got this really complex dynamic of the tricky situation that those who are facing the most risk are experiencing right now. And what can we do to intervene at the landlord, property management, and building level to ensure that the people who own and manage these spaces are creating a habitable environment? Or what can we do to support tenants and residents specifically within their unit? Because not everyone in the building, let's say some people have air conditioning and can afford it, and others don't. You know, where are we making some of those sort of people-to-people interventions that can help to address the need for increasing our ability to access cooling and or to avoid urban heat when we are, for the most part, operating within our existing built environment?
See, any other questions? Or
David has a
comments?
raised hand.
Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't see it. David, yeah, what's your question?
One, I wanted to really underscore the importance of the multidisciplinary thought process that you were going through between finance, design, urban planning, reimagining, policy, et cetera. One of the questions I'm curious to hear in your discussions about producing the document, doing the research, were things where there were potential contradictions. And there's one, the obvious one is you put in more air conditioning, it may cool the interior, but actually may generate more heat on the outside and depending on your energy source, increase global warming in the process. But were there other things that you talked about that were like real trade-offs where the choice for doing one thing actually produced other things. So one of the great examples is, the idea that we could put solar panels in the Sahara to generate global energy. I mean, it turned out that if you cover 20% of the Sahara Desert, it increases temperature by 1.5 degrees Celsius alone because of the amount of absorbed solar gain into the solar panels as opposed to it being reflected off of the sand. So where can you point to what were the biggest things where you were looking at, like, well, if we propose that, how do we qualify it against something else because of the interdisciplinary nature of the thought process?
There's something that came up for me when we were doing we were talking to professionals across the world. And I think it was LA, if that's correct, where they were just like painting, they were like, oh, let's just paint the streets white, to like, and just create like all these reflective surfaces. But like, it's not comfortable for people that are walking around, like, because it's just reflecting light like right back into people's faces. So we were like, oh, that's cool. But then we thought about it, we're like, oh no, that's that. And then like there's also the maintenance costs for that as well, because it's white. So if you have cars, pedestrians, it's gonna be gray very soon. So I thought that was one thing that stuck out to me, that at first I was like, oh, that sounds really cool. But then like we start thinking about it more, I was like, oh yeah, no, that's like an issue. And it's, yeah, maintenance costs, and also it's too reflective. It makes people uncomfortable because there are some things that they may make a difference, but we also have to take into account people's comfort.
I think one interesting kind of externality type of thing that came up for me, particularly in the context of COVID-19, is the concept of the cooling center. If that has been like the center point or a landmark strategy for a lot of cities, when we're entering into a period of time when we want to reduce crowding and not promote those kinds of environments, what are we doing to try to address some of those concerns? So, we're taking into account public health in multiple ways, and how do we address those multiple threats as they overlap with each other? And I guess I'd bring up on the positive side that the emphasis that we found throughout our research on the positive externalities of interventions that including more water features and things like trees. Can't overstate the positive benefits from multiple angles of bringing nature further into the city, and it helps with heat, but it also helps with so many other things, including air quality, including public health, including the pedestrian experience. So that was on the flip side of what's positive. Those are spillover impacts that we were really sort of happy to learn about. Austin, you can go ahead and unmute.
Thank you. Thanks for your report. Thanks for your time tonight. Thanks for all you're doing. A map stuck out that you had, which was showing the Harlem area and the northeast part of Brooklyn, that had a stark different, tone of the dark red versus other parts of the city. Was there anything that you found of characteristics that were in the urban fabric of design that stuck out, from one area that had that versus another one that you said, wow, those are some of the key points? And then another thing that was, I think Mallory was talking about, that's come up a lot, is like, wow, as designers, we put up a shade screen. It makes perfect sense. It gives human, they feel better inside, and the energy efficiency of it. Why can't we get it done? Is it because of the triple bottom line from developers, because it's more expensive? And does that mean is we have to face the policy and say, we have to do it, it has to be a law, and we keep on pushing mechanical heating and cooling, but why don't we implement these things? Why aren't they getting done? Why aren't there trees on every block? There's some simple strategies that we do, and why aren't we seeing them? Sorry, that was probably 5 questions in one.
No, it's okay. I think we're all just mulling. I think on the
Yeah.
physical side of what we noticed about, the Bronx and Harlem, and when we were kind of toward Upper Manhattan, I'm interested what, Mike and Mallory, you all observed. I think we talked about it a little bit in the first scenario, but there are a lot of aspects of the specific built environment that create the particular environment of heat and heat danger that's in those neighborhoods. And, as Mike was mentioning, when you look at that map, you can see, or you can feel very directly that it feels a lot hotter. And so when you go into those neighborhoods, there aren't as many trees. There is this kind of like wide open, streetscape where you've got so much asphalt and concrete that really holds a lot of the heat. So everything that you've all like learned about the heat island effect are really at play there. You've got these interesting kind of wind and air circulation impacts because of the design and the relationship of the buildings to the streetscape that hold heat and circulate heat sort of, where people are. You've also got a lot of industrial buildings, heavy traffic, kind of overlapping factors that create this pedestrian environment that's really hot, as well as these buildings that, hold heat. They're older buildings, that are facing a lot of the challenges that we've discussed on the call today. So I don't know if there's anything else that Mike and Mallory would add up in particular about the neighborhood and sort of upper Manhattan that kind of from the physical, built environment perspective, we'd call out would create this kind of effect.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see more landscape designers involved in building repositioning at the neighborhood level. I feel like, sometimes the way projects end up, that's not always part of the brief, or people don't want to pay for it, or it's hard to have a landscape project in and of itself because a lot of that space is within the public realm. But I think trying to encourage the incorporation of landscape design wherever possible would be a great thing to advocate for on some of these projects. And in some cases, some of the things we've spoken about in terms of envelope design and why it's not getting done is a lot of times it costs more, and it can be difficult to really convince, these suggestions that are above and beyond code, the value that they have. Oftentimes presenting the case of, the life cycle cost and, how it will save energy costs over time can really help. But unfortunately, a lot of developers are still driven by first costs, and that can still be a huge barrier, unfortunately.
I think on the why things aren't getting done front, another thing to mention is that, in a lot of our research, we did come across this argument of, because it's not a regulation, it's not really coming into effect on a wide enough scale. But, think about how that really, in many ways, a lot of the things that are being kind of proposed right now would only apply to new construction. And so, when we're building and operating within our existing landscape, the majority of the intervention actually really needs to be, intervening for our existing buildings. And so, there's a lot of complexity when you're thinking about that. Mallory's thinking of developers, and when you think about not just developers, but property managers, people aren't even in the United States to ask them the question of, would you be willing to, invest in this new type of rooftop? And so the process of actually negotiating across a neighborhood with property owners is very difficult and complex. And deciding within an existing landscape or an existing neighborhood fabric, what to do, it really takes everything we've been saying about this multidisciplinary collective approach. And that's very difficult to arrange. And so it really takes that kind of collaborative participatory dialogue and discourse to make concerted efforts here. And that's where our emphasis was at the end of this research project, was to say, if we want to see the change at the wide enough scale that we're talking about, it really has to come from the people in the neighborhood and all these different disciplines working together to address these multifaceted problems.
And one quick thing I wanted to add as to why this isn't addressed, and Lydia did bring this up, is it is structural racism because of who is affected by this issue. It's not taken as seriously. So for instance, in the Bronx, we learned not only is heat a problem, but children did not have drinking water in their school because it wasn't. I was like, why isn't this a bigger story? I think if you saw the same issue happening in Greenwich Village, it would be in the New York Times, and something would happen very quickly about it. I guarantee you. But because this is an issue that definitely deals with people that are Black and brown, there is not really any sort of urgency around fixing this issue. So I think it's unfortunately up to the people that are living in those neighborhoods to advocate for themselves and to organize and create political will to change these things, like just having to put pressure on their local representatives, putting pressure on the state representatives, and putting pressure on federal representatives to actually shift how we look at these issues and make sure that there is more equity in dealing with public health issues like urban heat.
For the designers in the room, I wanna bring the positive spin to it, which is that I think also as this conversation picks up kind of speed within the public discourse, or more thinking and talking about it, we're able to identify some of the specific things that you could even ask for. This wasn't an issue that, 10 years ago, if I was speaking with somebody and I said, heat's a problem, they say, yeah, but I have my air conditioner, or it's still difficult even to go into these communities and say that heat is a problem for you because it's 85 degrees. We know that scientifically, but let's say you're dealing with, communities or community members who've come from, let's say, places in the Caribbean. It's not connecting for them. You're saying 85 degrees. I'm used to living in 97-degree heat. There's still a lot of these communications barriers around, how do we begin to understand collectively what this issue actually is, what can we do about it? And there's a lot of creativity that's happening right now around how can we specifically develop not just the desire to do something about it, but our recommendation for what do we want? There's different things that we can do, and how are we putting together some of those ideas and building support around these kind of particular interventions, things like creating a maximum temperature that defines our habitable spaces. That's something that it hasn't been a proposal in the public discourse, up until now. And so these types of policy solutions are being introduced, and we can, build a narrative around them to say, what would be the possible benefit or impact of doing that? There's a lot of open opportunity for us to be creative in this space.
Well, I do want to, again, thank you all, both for the topic and being role models, and your interdisciplinary work. And also have to add, of course, extra outside of your jobs. This is completely volunteer and service to addressing these issues. And so I can see that we're starting to thin out. We had a really robust audience between 30 and 40 people all night. And so I can see that it's a really important topic. I've, the people who are left, Nadia's also mentioning she really loved the interaction. I think we're not used to that. We're just used to being spoken to, not spoken with. So thank you for that. Thank you, Nadia, for mentioning that. For those who are left, we will have a thank you email sent to everybody with the link to the report, because that's of great interest to everybody. Anything else you'd like to add before we close the session?
Thanks. Thanks for coming, and feel free to reach out to us with questions. We're happy to. And for people at the new school, I am I work there, so
yeah, we want to build a pop-up. We're the school to build a pop-up for you.
Yeah. Yeah, if you all want to collaborate with me on anything or have any questions,
David's
feel
the
free to
dean. He's here. He's stuck it through the end. He believes in this. He's going to create the elective.
Incorporating into street seats, we should have public water available.
Should do it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you so much. Really, really thank you for the depth and thought and carefulness of the discussion. And the interaction was really, really important to be able to recognize that it requires participation, even at this level, to engage and make social change. So thank you for setting that up.
Well, thank you, everyone. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Thursday evenings.
Yeah, it's dinner time. Bon appetit, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.